Definitely didn't
I
know
believe that
much
there are
about my
definitely
rights,
many
and I'm
adults
really
in my
glad that
life who
I've
have
learned
very
about
little
it because
understanding of what children's
that would have
rights
been a lot
are.
more helpful for
For
me when I
example,
was
at
going
my
through
school, I
things,
have
and I
multiple
really
teachers who quite
appreciate
frequently yell,
the fact that
swear,
the young
threaten, and call us
advisors
students
will
inappropriate.
learn all
It
of
is about having an identity, a place to call home with a loving family that provides them with protection. It is about being allowed to learn, grow, and form opinions without judgment, and making sure that every person, no matter where they are in the world or how old they are, knows the rights that children have. I believe that every child and adult needs to know these rights, as well as have access to information in which they can continue to learn how to support and uphold these rights.
I believe young people have a brief idea on what rights are, but I do not believe they understand what their rights are and what they have a right to. Some adults might not understand child's rights because it's only semi-new that it's become more open and talked about. So when they were a child, they weren't taught about their rights. Some adults also don't like the fact children have rights because it removes a part of their dominant behavior. I speak very highly on the right anyone has to a say in a decision that affects them, because horrible things can come out of a situation a child was forced into without a word on if they were uncomfortable about it.
I believe that there are definitely many adults in my life who have very little understanding of what children's rights are. For example, at my school, I have multiple teachers who quite frequently yell, swear, threaten, and call us students inappropriate names, which is clearly disrespectful, but these teachers obviously have no awareness that they are in violation of our rights to feel safe and respected.
They don't really want to. I don't think people actually want to tell children what rights they have, because it's just, yeah. Then they have power, and who wants a child to have power?
I definitely tried to get my friends into learning about their rights after I joined 54 Reasons, because at school, literally the other day, we were all going through the 54 Reasons rights page together, so that was fun.
Hi, everyone. So you've just heard from the young advisors, as was up on the screen. We just wanted to set the tone and thought, rather than spending those couple of minutes by me saying we'll just give everyone a couple more minutes, we thought we'd do that by introducing some young people themselves and their perspective on rights. For background, all of those young people you heard are under 18 and they're formal advisors to our organisation. They're all casual employees, and they advise us on a range of matters and help us be accountable to children and young people. We'll hear a bit more from them later. So first of all, to start, of course, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that each of us are on. I'm on Gadigal land today, which is part of the Eora Nation. But please acknowledge each of the First Nation that each of you are on, and on our behalf, pay respects to the elders, past and present. Also really want to all of the First Nations people on the line today, really want to acknowledge you. So thank you. And our agenda, we'll move on to. We're going to be moving through. It's a reasonable amount of time, but it'll take us a bit to get through. We will have time for a Q&A during this, so it won't be responding to it as we go, but we'll be collecting information as we go and have the opportunity, hopefully, if we all run to time, to respond to the Q&A. We'll sort of gather that up and cluster questions or comments as they come through. Really want to thank, as you see on the screen here, all the people that have joined us, the sort of experts that we've got to talk about systems change and using rights to influence systems today. So really appreciate the effort, the time, and the willingness to come together to talk about this today. So thank you all. Jumping on through, today, of course, great day to be hosting this with all of you online. That it's World Children's Day. We know this is the anniversary for the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. Importantly, too, this year being 100 years since our founder of this organisation drafted the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, 100 years on. But today we're here to talk, as I said, about systems change. and if you've joined us before, you've heard me talk about we're not here for ideology. There's a place for that, but we're not about ideology, and thankfully neither are the people joining us today. We really want to, whilst in the context of systems, talk about how to make rights real. And by that, of course, we mean real in the way our actions, in our behaviour, in the work that we do, and so that ultimately they are real and experienced by children and young people. Just briefly, to provide context to the organisation, our strategy at 54 Reasons is all about taking a rights paradigm and a rights approach to our work, which is in each state and territory right across Australia. Hundreds of people doing that work in the areas of youth justice, domestic and family violence, children's development, and child protection. But just as an example, how we use rights to decide what we do and don't, where we do and don't sort of participate. We do child protection work, but we won't work within the statutory out-of-home care system, not because it's unimportant, it's incredibly important, but we don't believe that we can work in that space in a way that is rights respecting. We don't believe the system itself is rights respecting, and so we choose not to work in that. I guess just as an example of how we're using rights to guide our strategy, but ultimately our decision making. Again, those of you who have engaged with us before would know that we've gone through that, creation of a sub-brand for our organisation here in Australia, and created all things really. You should be able to look and see and experience a rights approach through everything that we do, and that's through our practice frameworks, our name itself, the reference to the 54 articles, our impact measurement, the voice and participation framework that we've got, and just as one little example as well that our colleague Howard here has introduced for our team in the decision making and leading this organisation, how we use a decision register that actually tracks the advice and information, what we're hearing from children and young people through the various mechanisms that we have, how we're using that advice to make and then track the decisions that are needed to run this organisation. So I'll just encourage you, it is a bit of time. No doubt it'll be very engaging, but hopefully you'll stick around right to the end. It's a culmination of sort of 3 years of thinking and dreaming and work behind the scenes and getting prepared for this day. And we will have what to us is a very special announcement at the end of the session. So please stick around. Other than that, I'll move on and get into it. Enough of me, and hand over to John. I'm not going to do a full intro because you will all know who John is, and that's part of the reason that you've joined today, him and our other esteemed colleagues. Just to say that John's kind of a big deal, and internationally renowned for his work, and very grateful to be joined by you today. So I've been reassured, John, that it's 10 minutes is your session. You're going to tell us everything you know in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Matt. Thanks for having me as well. So obviously I'd like to acknowledge I'm joining today for the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. So 10 minutes is a big task to cover a really important topic, but let's have a crack at it as well. So I got an email this week from the Australian Institute, and they're about to launch their new book called What's the Big Idea? That book contains 32 big ideas for a better Australia. Surprise, surprise, I don't think it includes a chapter about children's rights. So I wasn't invited to make a contribution, and I didn't see the names of any prominent young people either. But if I was invited to make that contribution, this is what I might say. So if you want a big idea that will first recognise and respect the dignity and worth of every child, no matter who they are, where they come from, what they've done, an idea that will outline in detail the interests that every child needs to secure a life of dignity, a list of interests that's been agreed to by 196 states, and extends to all children in all contexts, the home, school, early childhood, healthcare, child protection, youth justice. An idea that will outline the obligations in detail of adults to secure those interests of children. Again, obligations accepted by 196 states. An idea will offer a model that will really importantly balance competing interests between individual children, their parents, the community, other children, and in fact, broader social objectives like health and safety. A model that will recognise and respect parental interests with appropriate limits. A model that will respect and recognise cultural differences, a model based on evidence, not assumptions and speculation, and importantly, a model that produce outcomes that benefit not only children, but also society, socially, culturally, politically, and economically. So if you want all these things, then I think is a big idea, a human rights-based approach to matters involving children, or to summarise, a rights-based approach is a model that we want to adopt as well. But there is a catch, and this is the obligation that falls back on us as adults. And we have to undertake, I think, a really serious dose of self-reflection, both personally. I have 4 children, and I'm sure I don't always get this right, as you can ask them. On the weekend, I coached 100 10-year-old, 8-year-old boys in a football session. I reckon I made mistakes all over the place, but what does this self-reflection look like? First, we have to recognise that our best intentions are often not enough. And in fact, our actions may, in fact, often cause harm to children. Historically, we know this has happened. Talking about the stolen generation is the obvious example, but even in contemporary times, the most prominent example is occurring right before our eyes this week in federal parliament with the proposed ban on children's access to social media. Many of you are lobbying to address this concern that we have, that in fact this is really lodged in ideas around a welfare approach that doesn't in any way take into account the rights and interests of young people as well. And many of you may have read the article by a 12-year-old girl who talked about the impact that having access to social media meant for her in terms of joining a community and having access to a place where she could belong, and in fact that caused her to be able to save her life. So we have lots of contemporary examples where best interests and best intentions don't always work. The other catch, of course, is we have to recognise that for far too long, we've defined children by their vulnerabilities. So our default as adults is, again, as a parent I do this all the time, is to protect them, to save them, because we know better. Or in the case of youth justice, we define them by their mistakes, and we fail to recognise their humanity. We also fail to recognise that such mindsets fail to recognise both the capacities and abilities of children, but also importantly, our responsibility in contributing to the conditions in which they've made, in fact, those mistakes as well. We also need to recognise again that we often fail to see children in the first instance, that even when we do, we still prefer either consciously or unconsciously that they are not to be heard. And even when they are, their views are devalued. And again, I'll put my hand up. As a parent, I do this regularly and routinely, not intentionally, but unaware. This is how adults tend to behave. So these features I've just outlined, this area of self-reflection, is what I'll refer to as a welfare-based approach, a deficit-based approach. It fails to recognise the strengths of children and the strengths that underlie a rights-based approach. I'd argue, and we can discuss it, this deficit-based approach, this welfare model, still remains a dominant model when it comes to policy concerning children in Australia, and is recognised very much in the proposed ban on social media. So if we want to move beyond a welfare approach and we want to adopt the elements of a rights-based approach, then what do we have to do? I'd argue we have to make a commitment, one, to recognising children have evolving capacities and abilities and lived experiences and expertise that must inform the development of policy in all aspects of their lives. Importantly, we have to also enable and assist children to express their views and take them seriously. I'm assuming everyone here knows about Article 12. Of course, a rights-based approach is more than simply Article 12, but it's so central to the idea of giving views and voices to children in all matters that affect their lives. I got an email this week from a group called Emerging Minds, which many of you might follow. It's a really important organisation providing mental health services for children. And it said we have to celebrate Children's Rights Day with a moment of loudness. And I like that idea. We've got to make and amplify this idea that children's views have to be heard. We also have to commit ourselves to the rights outlined in the CRC. You heard from the youth advisors to 54 reasons that most children don't know about their rights. Again, my children have been at school for many, many years. On not one occasion has anyone actually given them a copy of the convention or taught them what those rights actually are. I should say I try at home, but I don't always succeed in convincing them that they need to learn these things. But of course, I'd argue this should be part of our curriculum and embedded in every aspect of their lives in school. We must educate all children, but also importantly, educate all adults about these rights and the idea of a rights-based approach. This is a bigger project, but it has to actually happen if we are to not just see groups like Save the Children, 54 Reasons, adopt and embrace a rights-based approach, but see this model rolled out across every aspect of society where we have an impact on children. So we have to also create institutions, systems and processes at the federal, state and local level and within organisations that allow for the implementation of a rights-based approach. This includes, for my mind, the creation of, for example, a community of practice, a centre of excellence, some sort of hub where we can share, disseminate and facilitate discussions about what it means to implement a rights-based approach in practice. And the last and perhaps the scariest thing is this, and we heard it again, as always, the wisdom that comes from young people. As adults, we have to give up some of the power we enjoy as adults and actually trust and believe in our children. So I want to finish with quoting from what's called the Imagination Declaration, which was adopted by the youth delegation to the Gama Festival in 2019. And so I'll read this short extract. It's time to think differently. With 60,000 years of genius and imagination in our hearts and our minds, we can be one of the groups that transform the future of life on Earth for the good of us all. We are not the problem, we are the solution. When you think of an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander kid, or in fact any kid, imagine what's possible. Don't define us through the lens of disadvantage or label us as limited. Expect the best of us. And let us spread our wings and soar higher than ever before. We urge you to give us the freedom to write a new story. Now, for me, that's a big idea and it's a good one. I'd like to end there by saying in a very short phrase that a rights-based approach is really about seeing the world through a different lens in ways that allow for children to write their own and new story. Thanks so much, Matt, and I'll hand back over to Howard.
Thanks very much, John. I hope that everyone else is feeling as inspired as I really am now. Having just listened to you, I think you've done a terrific job in sketching out that big idea of a child rights-based approach, bringing it to life. And also, I really love the way you spoke about that from your own experience as an adult and a parent who's got a responsibility in relation to children. So thank you. Hey everyone, my name's Howard Chu. I'm 54 Reasons Head of Policy and Advocacy, and I'm joining today from Wurundjeri country like John. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm going to take the next few minutes to talk really quite briefly about how we can communicate more effectively about children's rights in Australia. Or to say that another way, how can we speak about children's rights in a way that will actually be meaningful to the people that we're speaking to, so that they will act in ways that respect and uphold those rights. And so the starting point here is really what you can see on screen, that it's not just what you say or what we say, but how we say it. And by how we say it, I'm talking about the words and the language that we use, the metaphors that we choose to employ when we're talking about children's rights, which stories and narratives we want to put into play, which values we're trying to activate, and also what we don't say, what we deliberately don't say as unhelpful language or ways of speaking about children's rights. And that includes the messengers who speak as well. So in other words, how do we frame children's rights in a way that will make a difference? And just to say it out loud, communicating about children's rights in Australia, it's challenging, it's really tough. So if you were to go down to the proverbial pub or the barbecue or speak in the public square about children's rights, if you're lucky, you might be met by questions, people not understanding what children's rights are. You very well may run into hostility or active sort of disagreement with the idea that children can have rights, wherever you want to talk about rights. And so recognising all of this, we at 54 Reasons have kicked off a program of research to really investigate how to frame children's rights in ways that are effective and that will actually reach the people that we want to communicate with, that we all want to communicate with. And so the idea here is to ground our communication in evidence, in the evidence of what will work as effective communication, and really importantly, also to develop a very practical set of strategies and communications toolkits that everyone can use so that we can speak about rights in a way that is heard. If we're talking about communicating about rights or speaking about children's rights, the audiences for this are really all adults, so very much speaking with parents and caregivers, with families and communities about children's rights. Also across our sector in the broader sense, anyone who works with children and young people, and with government, of course, with the media and more broadly with the general public as well. So speaking with adults. The way that this research program has been shaped up is that we have commissioned the Frameworks Institute to do the research. Many of you will be familiar with their work. They're a fantastic social science research organisation. This is their bread and butter, really impactful research into the mindsets and the communication that works to change people's minds on social issues. They've done a lot of work in the space of children's topics in Australia, including around effective narratives about early childhood development, parenting, child mental health, some other topics, and also overseas. And that research is shaped up in 4 phases. The first phase we have commissioned in partnership with our friends at the Queensland Family and Child Commission, and that's now complete. So I'm going to just really quickly skate through some of the interesting and key findings from that and give you all a sense as to what will come in the following planned phases of work and how you can all get involved as well. So phase 1 is complete. It's currently being written up in what I think will be a pretty concise and really practical memo, which will be published shortly and spread far and wide because we want everyone to be able to use these insights. And this first phase has involved identifying the core ideas about children's rights that we need to communicate, and also reviewing how we are currently, or how children's rights are currently being communicated about in Australia. In the grey box, you can see there, the research team has done a scan of how our sector currently frames children's rights, and we've defined sector really broadly there to include all those who have an interest in children and their rights. What you can see there is, I won't speak through all these frames, but there are several frames that are in wide use. Some of these frames, I would say, are much more meaningful and better defined than others. Some of these frames are more closely connected to the core ideas of children's rights than others. And inevitably, some of them are more helpful and influential than others. But important to know that these are the sorts of frames that are in play at the moment by those of us who are actually trying to promote children's rights. Then when the research team looked at how the media is framing and communicating about children and their rights, this is really important because, as we all know, the media does have an outsized influence in shaping how the general public thinks about children and their rights and topics that are related, but also in a meaningful way reflects the way the public does think about those issues. So 3 major frames emerged from that analysis. None of them are particularly helpful, unfortunately. Children's rights in the media are often positioned as being in opposition to community safety, particularly in the context of youth justice. They're also commonly positioned as being in opposition to parents' rights. And there's this really pernicious kind of idea that's deeply held that children actually are too immature to have rights or to exercise them. And those of you who are familiar with the actual ideas of children's rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child will recognise that these are all based on misunderstandings of rights. All of these frames have been very directly addressed by the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child over and over, but nonetheless, that's the landscape that we are communicating within. And then from that flows a couple of key challenges for us in seeking to communicate well about children's rights. Firstly, actually, there is a really limited public discourse. So what that means is that most people don't understand what children's rights are or why they matter. And when children's rights get onto the agenda, it's usually when there's a problem of some kind. Second key challenge is a strong strain of zero-sum thinking, where there is a belief, often implicit rather than even explicit, that children's rights are in a zero-sum relationship with the rights of adults or groups of adults. So this idea that there is a conflict between children's rights and, for example, parents' rights, which comes through in that media framing. So all of this is really important to ground us to understand what the current state of the discourse is about children's rights. Now, we have scoped this whole program of research in multiple phases, and that's really important. There's a rigour to the approach that the Frameworks Institute brings, which they've demonstrated through their impact in other domains. We need to follow that to make sure that the ultimate strategies and messaging toolkits that we develop are actually evidence-based and really reliable. Having said that, there are some emerging recommendations that we've been able to identify based on the research that has been done so far, and from the broader body of knowledge around communicating about children's rights and about framing relating to issues to do with children and families. And so what's on screen now is just a selection of a few of them, just to give you a sense. We will be sharing these slides afterwards, but to give you an idea of some of the emerging recommendations, which we will validate, test, and build into something much more comprehensive, is certainly what we plan to do based on further research. And lastly, so this is the really exciting bit for me, this is what comes next. The next phase of research that is planned is a deeper dive into the underlying mindsets that the general public in Australia actually holds about children and young people and their rights. So in other words, these deeply seated and often unconscious beliefs, assumptions, worldviews that people have that relate to children, and that really condition how they're going to react when we go and talk about children and their rights or about the substance of children's rights. That will give us the foundation to actually move ahead and develop the framing strategy. So I say strategy, but actually it'll be a really practical set of tools and suggestions for a core narrative and, the way that children's rights can be spoken about in different contexts. So with consistency, but also with nuancing depending on who you're talking to and in what context. And the intent is to do that in a way that is in parallel with that framing strategy being really very much published, disseminated, so that everyone who should be interested in communicating better about children and their rights is brought along as part of that and is equipped to do that. So it is really exciting. We are really inviting new partners to join us for this next phase that's going to kick off in terms of investigating the mindsets. I think it's a great time to get involved with this work. So really just to issue that invitation now, if this is something that is interesting to you, if you are interested in how we can communicate better about children and their rights in Australia, do please get in touch. My details are there. And as I said, we will be sharing these slides and also the research memo very shortly, which you'll all be able to have a good look at. Now, we're going to change streams now, and it's my really great pleasure to introduce our next couple of speakers, who are Professors Sharon Bessell and Amanda Third. Now, Sharon is the Director of the Children's Policy Centre at the Australian National University. Amanda is the co-director of the Young and Resilient Research Centre at Western Sydney University, and in just a couple of minutes, they've agreed to have a conversation out loud in front of us, a conversation about children's rights, including children's experiences of their rights. Both Amanda's and Sharon's expertise is really widely recognised and respected within Australia and internationally, certainly as researchers, and I would also say as thinkers and as advocates and collaborators and doers. And, I think that the work that both Amanda and Sharon are doing with children and young people is really quite extraordinary. It's explicitly and very strongly rights-based and participatory. I'm hoping that they will be drawing from and sharing some of that work in the conversation they're about to have, and I'm really excited about this. So without further ado, let me hand over to you, Amanda and Sharon.
Thanks, Howard, and thank you for providing us with this wonderful opportunity to talk about one of our favourite topics. Sharon and I don't often get together to do this kind of thing. Well, we don't do it often enough, right, Sharon? So it's really lovely to be here with everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. It is. I'm looking forward to this conversation, Amanda. It's a shame we can't open it up to everyone, but with 400 people online, it's hard. So, yes, we'll lead off by sharing some ideas.
Yeah. So Sharon, obviously you've used child rights in your work for a very, very long time. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about why you do that and what's useful about a child rights framework.
Look, I think there are so many reasons why a child rights framework is important. And John mapped that out so beautifully for us at the start. But perhaps I could share 3 ideas, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Amanda. So I think one reason, John already mapped out that one of the most powerful reasons for using a child rights framework is that it gives us a comprehensive way of thinking about children's lives. And often we don't do that. We compartmentalise children's lives and the issues that really matter to them. And it also gives us a way of thinking about and challenging the way age-based hierarchies play out in our societies and in our communities. And it gives us a way of making children visible in our communities, in services and in policy and legislative frameworks. So as I said, I wanted to share 3 ways in which I think it can really matter. And Amanda, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those 3 ideas. So let's start at the policy level. I work in a public policy school, so this is something we're thinking about all the time, is how we can have better policy for better outcomes. And policy is very often silent when it comes to children and fails to consider how policy impacts on them. Now, on some issues, policy is very vocal on children, on youth justice or child justice. We've heard about the social media bans, and so there's a lot of activity around those issues. But on some issues, we don't hear about children at all. And that's where we have policy errors. I love this word errors that John used. So if we think about, for example, at the Commonwealth level, our social security legislation, it barely mentions children except in the context of child support. Employment and labour market legislation, urban planning. In all of these things, children are usually invisible. And that leads to really problematic outcomes because all of these things really impact on children's lives. I think social security legislation and employment legislation or labour market legislation impacts on children's lives more than almost anything else. But we never think about children because we think they're adult issues. So the convention gives us a way of thinking about children in policy. It also gives us a way of thinking about how we engage with children. And Amanda, maybe in a minute I can share the way we do research, but I want to let you respond and talk about what you do. The third point I wanted to make is that the convention gives us a way of advocating on behalf of children and with children. And Howard talked about both the lack of awareness and hostility towards children's human rights. But I think what we often miss and what we really need to communicate is that for parents and others that want the best outcomes for children, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is probably the most powerful advocacy tool we have, not just to work for children, but to work with them. So, Amanda, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think we can use the Convention as a framework or child rights as a framework.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, and look, I think, you're preaching to the choir a little bit there, Sharon. I don't have any major points of disagreement, obviously, but I think when I try and think about the value of a child rights approach, I guess the thing that strikes me is that there are sort of two levels at which child rights seems to me really significant. I think the first is a quite practical one, which might sound surprising because actually child rights often feel very abstract, and indeed I think as the work that 54 Reasons is undertaking shows us, really we need to find very concrete ways to activate child rights. But for me, there is a really a powerful practical capability in a child rights approach, and I think that comes back to what we might think of as the 3 Ps. And those of you who are child rights aficionados, or people who I guess might be, might have that really in-depth knowledge of the convention. Obviously, when we distill the convention down to the 3 Ps, we are in a sense sort of reducing the convention in ways that can be unhelpful. But I think as a shorthand, it's helpful to remember that the convention really lays out 3 kinds of rights for children: provision rights, protection rights, and participation rights. And it's a kind of very radical document in granting children civic and political rights that are equivalent to those enjoyed by adults in our society. But I think, as others have already gestured so far today, when it comes to children, often it's that protectionist lens that dominates our thinking. We think of children as vulnerable, innocent, needing protection. And a child rights framework is a very practical tool for reminding ourselves that we need to think holistically about a child's experience. We need to value their capabilities and their strengths. And we need to remember that it's not just about protecting them, but about making sure that they have the things to live a good life, and also that they have views and ideas about how to change the world, that and powerful capabilities to contribute to decision making. So I think the child rights frame is really helpful as a sort of practical tool that we bring along with us into the work that we do face to face with children or in other settings, to remind us about those things. But I think also, often when we talk about rights, we talk in a very, in that abstract register, but we think about rights as a legal framework. And certainly those basic legal guarantees of children's rights are a very important part of the ecology that can give life to children's rights as a reality. So while those legal rights are important, though, I think I also am really interested in this idea of rights because it gives us a creative way of imagining not just children, but childhood. What does a good childhood look like? How can we deliver on that? And for me, child rights is, as Howard mentioned earlier, it's a really aspirational kind of way of thinking, right? It's much more than that minimum viable product version of policy making. It's like an invitation to really think expansively about how we deliver a world in which children can thrive. So I think for me, I find that kind of optimistic and expansive vision that underpins child rights. Really helpful, not least because sometimes working for children's rights can be challenging and difficult. But also, I think, we just need to keep imagining how we want the world to look for the next generation, in partnership, obviously, with the next generation. Yeah, but Sharon, also I think there are some big challenges, aren't there, to using a rights-based framework. I think, that abstraction is kind of one of them. It's about how to make it concrete. Also, I guess I've picked up on a lot on the ways that certain entities or individuals pick up on particular child rights to kind of, they cherry pick those rights in order to take action on them. Like one of those that I see happen, see it happening quite often is the best interests thing, which obviously is really like it's one of the 4 key principles that motivates the convention. But often it's sort of cherry picked and used as a way to legitimize adults making decisions. I wonder, Sharon, what are some of the other challenges that you sort of perceive in relation to child rights framings?
Look, I think I'll pick up first on that point that you make around, or a couple of points that you made, Amanda, and so many fantastic points there. But I think that issue of protection versus whatever else, protection versus participation, protection versus children being able to exercise their agency and their rights. I think this is a really false argument that we need to challenge, because fundamentally, we can't protect children if we don't understand what they may need to be protected from, and we can't understand what challenges children may be facing unless we genuinely listen to them and have conversations with them, and then work towards solutions in dialogue and work towards solutions together. And I think certainly this is what we're seeing playing out in the debates around the social media ban, that perhaps there hasn't been, well, perhaps there most certainly hasn't been enough of that kind of conversation. Because I think this is such a powerful example, because the internet can be a very dangerous place for children. We hear in our research about some of the really dark places that children find themselves in. But a ban is not the way to respond to that. Understanding how social media is working for children and what's not working for children by asking them and talking to them is the way to approach that. So I think it's about holding these things together. We should be able to hold in more than one important principle in our minds at the same time. And so I think that issue of prioritising protection over all else is something that we really need to challenge, because we can't protect children if we don't also listen to them, but respect the whole suite of rights that the convention provides. And so I think that's one of the challenges, but I don't think that's insurmountable. I think that is really about changing the framework through which we think. And the video that was shared at the very outset talked about, there was this beautiful comment that said, rights give children power, and who wants to give children power? And I think I wanted to pick up on something that Howard said in his slides, which is that we need to think beyond a zero-sum game. And we certainly need to think about power as more than a zero-sum game. Sharing power can be incredibly constructive. And if we're able to genuinely share power with children, I think that aspiration you talk about of creating a better world for all of us becomes very real. And creating the kind of world that most of us would want for children becomes very real. But wielding power over others is incredibly damaging. And I think this is our challenge, that often adults feel that they need to control children, they need to wield power over them. And so I think thinking really deeply about the nature of power and what that means is crucial to shifting the way we think about children and the place that we put them in our society, and reimagining what the world might look like when children can be part of deciding what their own place is. But Amanda, I wanted to pick up and have a little bit more of a conversation on this idea of cherry picking. And perhaps I could explain why, because I agree with you entirely that cherry picking rights for a particular agenda is really problematic. But I also think the convention itself is quite complex and covers a huge amount of territory, which is part of its strength. But it's also part of the challenge of implementing it. And so I wanted to share with you the way we think about the research we do with children, um, and perhaps reflect on, is this cherry picking? Should we think differently? Or is this a way of drawing out rights that can actually help us think differently? So we take a rights-based approach to the research we do with children. We try to hold all that the convention means in place at once. But there are 4 articles that we particularly draw on. So Article 12, which is about children expressing their views on matters that affect them, and we would argue pretty much everything affects children's lives. But we also draw on Article 13, which is about ensuring that information is shared with children and the children can impart information in ways that are age appropriate. So that idea of participation becomes meaningful for children at the place they're now at. We also draw on, of course, the best interests principle, which you mentioned. And we try to use this to say, when we are designing our research, genuinely, is this in the best interests of children? Or are we pursuing our own agenda? How do we flip things to make sure that this agenda is for and about children? And Article 36, which might seem odd in relation to research, but this is about protecting children from exploitation. And so we keep this in mind because research with children can often be quite extractive and become exploitative. And so we use this principle to say, again, how are we engaging with children and whose agenda are we pursuing? So on the one hand, maybe we're cherry picking rights, but I think what we're doing is kind of drawing on the rights that in this particular context help us to genuinely hand over that power to children. But Amanda, this is something I wanted to talk to you about for a long time. So I would love your reflections on how we balance that, drawing on particular articles that are relevant while not cherry picking for our own interests.
Yeah, Sharon, and I think that's the big challenge of working with the child rights framing, to my mind, is remembering that indivisibility of children's rights. Like, I think what, the way I sort of conceptualize the way that the convention and accompanies me in my work is that, oh, sorry, can you hear me okay? You've just disappeared, Sharon. Oh, yeah, there you are. So I think about the convention as kind of accompanying me on my work with children, and really at all times it's a kind of a prompt to keep thinking in a reflexive way about how things are unfolding and whether or not all the pieces are in the right sorts of places and what adjustments and so on might need to be made. So I think often when we talk about rights, we think about rights as an end, right? An end point. At one point, we're going to live in a world where children can realise their rights. But actually, I think the convention, if you think about it in a more open-ended way, it becomes a much more useful tool to us, right? And what I mean by that is that at any given moment in a process, whether it's a research process, an interaction with a child in a casework scenario, whether it's advocating for policy change with a decision maker at federal government level, whatever that situation is, bringing the rights framework along with you and constantly keeping not only all 54 reasons in mind, but also the spirit of that instrument with you helps us to keep weighing the consequences of our decisions. It helps us mitigate against unintended consequences, right? It's a way of moving consciously forward with, for, and on behalf of children, right? So I think it's a really, really beautiful tool. I think you're right, Sharon, that the participation piece is especially important because, of course, it is really hard to put children's rights on the agenda often. And it's very easy to slip into that sort of cherry picking mode of saying, now we have to do this, we have to hold this right up above the others because that's the most important thing. I think actually, no, we have to keep being really, really careful to balance those different understandings, or to balance the different kinds of rights that children have as we proceed. But the participation piece is often neglected. It can be done very tokenistically or in an extractive mode as you're gesturing. And I think, you know, we just need to be really, really careful to really make a concerted effort to get down to that street level view of children's everyday lives, to remember that children are very, very diverse in their personalities, their orientations, their life circumstances. And I think the convention reminds us to keep weighing all of that as we go. And I think, you know, it's not, I think often the participation piece, we get all enthusiastic, right, about gathering the data or gathering children's voices. And we don't often pay enough attention to the bits that come after that. So for us, I think one of the things that we've tried to do is to really think carefully about how we make sense of what children tell us, and therefore how we might activate children's insights in decision-making processes, because that's really what a lot of our work aims to do, is it aims to work closely with children so we can channel their insights and experiences into adult decision-making forums. But then there's also the question of representation. How do you represent children's voices without assuming authorial kind of control of their voices, without inadvertently imposing an adult perspective on them? How do you kind of enable children's voices to stand on their own terms? And I don't think this is something that we've worked out entirely, but it's something we're very, very conscious of and constantly experimenting with. And I think this is, in a sense, like the real beauty of the convention, is that it is an invitation to experiment consciously, reflexively, and in a way that is committed to really liberating, I guess, children's experiences in the process. And I guess one other thought that's sort of emerging for me is that I think it's very hard often for adult decision makers to, well, it's not hard for them. They often don't take children's perspectives seriously enough. And one of the challenges that I'm thinking more and more about is, how do we actually embed children in adult decision-making processes? What kinds of transformations or adjustments need to be made to the ways that our institutions and structures work in order to make space for children's insights to shape the outcomes? And one little experiment that we've been running, and Sharon, I know you've been doing some really very similar and parallel work, is around child-centered measurement, right? This is a particular kind of political intervention, in the sense that we're trying to take that love of measurement that drives so much policy making, and to really work with children to understand their experiences and develop indicators and measures that would enable us to actually measure from children's perspectives whether or not initiatives to support their rights are actually impacting at that level of the child's everyday experience. And so that's an example, you know, and so I think we've developed indicators around a bunch of different things. And I know, Sharon, you've done beautiful work around indicators of poverty. But this is, I guess, what I'm sort of gesturing here is, I think we've got to think really creatively, work with and sort of subvert the tools that are available to decision makers in order to make space for children's perspectives.
Amanda, Amanda, I'll add to that, because I think there is something really powerful that we often miss when we think about the importance of taking a child rights perspective. And to kind of paraphrase what you've just said so beautifully, is I think rights are about not just the end but the means. It's about the journey we take as well as the end point of that journey. And when we start to think about our communities, our policy, our world in that way, it actually shifts things in very positive directions for everyone, regardless of age. And some of those challenges that we see around people being included in policy making, being listened to, being represented, are there regardless of age for some groups. But for children, it's more palpable because of those age-based hierarchies that really shape our society. But what we've seen in our research, and this is work that we've been doing around children's experiences of growing up in poverty, is that children have given us some incredible insights around how we need to think differently about what poverty is, how it impacts on our lives, and how we can do something about it. How we can shift things in ways that are transformative. And so we've developed, as you said, Amanda, some child-centred indicators coming from what children have said. What's been really interesting is recently we've been having conversations around the ways in which those same indicators would work powerfully for adults and help us to think very differently about the way adults experience their world and experience poverty. And so we often think children's rights are just for children or just for the things that impact on children. But actually, if we use the convention and the idea of child rights as a way of thinking transformatively and thinking about the kind of aspirations we want when we think about our communities now and into the future, then the impacts are often positive for everyone because we have a new frame, a new lens through which to consider some of the really challenging things that we face in the world today. And so I think that it's important that we think about child rights as child rights, but it's also important that we think about the transformative value of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, thinking about children's human rights, because that transformative value is much broader than children. Important as it is to transform the world for children.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Sharon. And I think there's two things that I think just to highlight in what you're saying. And one is that actually when you move from thinking about child rights as an end and thinking about it as a means, I think this brings real substance to the idea that we are accountable to children, right? Because you're accountable from one moment to the next, as opposed to accountable at the end of a process. So I think that's really, really super important. And I've just forgotten what the other one was, but
Is this around transformation for everyone?
Oh yes, it was around transformation for everyone. That's exactly right. I think, because our culture is geared to thinking about children as the future, and I'm going to resist singing Whitney Houston there, but because we think about children as the future, I think actually to really centre children's rights in all kinds of decision-making processes actually invites us to take a much longer view of history and accountability and the future, which helps to circumvent some of the very sort of knee-jerk decision making that can go on, as we're seeing with the social media bans, which I have to say seem to me not to be about children and their rights, but very much about a piece of regulation for addressing parents' anxieties. And that's not to say that I think parents are wrong to be anxious about their children's digital media use. As you said earlier, Sharon, I think there is indeed, children do face an unnecessarily high risk of harm online, and we need to be vigilant about that. And I think this is precisely why we need to really centre the child here, because actually what will make all parents feel better about their children's digital media practices is if we can solve the problems that children face online, right? So I think we really need to be doing better at delivering better solutions on that front.
Amanda, I just wanted to share some thinking and a piece that my wonderful colleague Kayla O'Sullivan and I wrote recently in response to the proposed social media ban, and we took a slightly different approach. So rather than engaging directly on whether the ban was appropriate or not, which people have been doing very powerfully. We ask the question, instead of taking things away from children's lives, what can we put into children's lives? And this is where I think the convention and a holistic approach could give us a different way of thinking about social media. Rather than going to a social media ban as our first response, how do we think about creating communities in which children can genuinely engage, where they can take part in the kinds of activities they may wish to, either online or face-to-face and in person? How do we broaden opportunities rather than narrow them? And perhaps there is a way of thinking about social media, keeping children safe, giving them opportunities, ensuring that they participate on their own terms, that takes us beyond online to thinking much more inventively, much more creatively about our societies broadly, with online being one element of children's lives, but not all of it. And I think the convention gives us a way of thinking, what do we add? What do we create for children rather than what we take away?
That's exactly right, Sharon. That's exactly right. And I think, it's been a shame actually that that the focus is on technology. I think one of the very one of the very difficult things about the debate is that it sort of empowers technology with capabilities it doesn't have, right? It says that technology has the capacity to cause harm and cause negative consequences for children's lives, when actually technology for the vast majority of children in Australia, at least, is very firmly integrated with a lot of their everyday activities, and indeed it augments often those activities. So I think we've seen a lot of talk in the mainstream media about how the ways technology use is taking away from face-to-face friendship or playground time or all of those other things that we think make up a good childhood. But in actual fact, it's not an opposition, it's a question of integration. And so how do we augment the ways that technology adds to all of those different dimensions of children's lives? How do we strengthen children's lives across the board in order that technology can have its proper place in children's lives? So I think we need to think much more ecologically about what's going on vis-a-vis children's and young people's digital technology practices. And certainly the convention is a really helpful instrument in doing so. Yeah, yeah. And I think also, Sharon, I think one of the other things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is really, you know, I'm concerned that we are throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think what we've been hearing from children quite consistently over the last few years is that they feel very alienated from government decision-making processes, but they also feel um, like the adult world is not listening, not responding to their needs, and they're feeling, well, the word they keep using, or the word that they did use recently very often in a study that we've done about how children are thinking about climate change, they kept saying that they feel abandoned. Now, abandonment is a strong word, and indeed it's a form of neglect, arguably. And we might say, well, it's not abandonment in the neglect sense, but a low level of abandonment at scale across our society of children that amounts to a significant issue. And I think what it really brings home is that those participation rights have to accompany the provision and protection rights, because children don't feel heard. They don't feel like adults are taking action on key issues that are impacting them, whether it's climate, cost of living, unemployment, unstable housing, etc., poverty. They don't feel like we're taking the right sorts of action, and are calling out for us to listen more carefully to their experiences and give them hope. They feel like they are going to be disproportionately burdened by these challenges, which are not of their making, and they are very, I think they remain hopeful, but they are also very conscious that they are not inheriting a world in which they are positioned to thrive, right? They're going to have to work very, very hard. And I think here we have to remember that children access digital media. One of the ways that they learn about, organise and take action on issues that they care about is using digital media. And here I think the question of imaginaries is really important. For the first time in history, or let me put it this way, once upon a time in the 19th century, when you sat down to read the national newspaper, that's one of the ways that you imagined yourself as a member of the nation. With digital media, that same kind of imaginative process goes on, right? You imagine yourselves into a world. And for the first time in history, children have the potential to think about themselves or understand themselves as part of a global political constituency of children. And that's a massive asset when we think about some of the big challenges that our societies have to resolve. And so I think we need to be very cautious about making sure that we preserve children's capacities to participate via social media as we move through this. It's going to be fundamental, I think, to realising their rights into the future, given the ways that these challenges play out at scale.
Amanda, we are almost at time on this conversation, but I would love to continue it on for much, much longer. I think what you've just said leaves us with such a powerful message. And I would add to that we see that same kind of sense of abandonment amongst the children that we work with and that we talk with and that we listen to. And some of what we see, particularly around poverty, I would argue is state neglect. It is because we have made policy choices that don't take account of children's human rights and what they need, what their interests are and what they're telling us. But I want to leave us with perhaps a bright spot, with perhaps a reason for optimism. The fact that we're having these conversations, I think, really matters. But I think adults, like children, feel that we are on the precipice, that there is so much that is challenging, and that we need to think in transformative ways. We need to do things differently. I think we do see a willingness amongst policymakers, amongst public servants, to listen to people's lived experiences, to complement the kinds of data that have normally driven policy. We're seeing the rise of things like the need for a wellbeing economy, to think very differently. And I think as we see recognition of the need for transformation, we have an opportunity and an obligation to ensure that children's rights are part of that. And if we can make that real, then I think we do have the possibility for genuine transformation in ways that not only improve children's lives now and into the future, but will make our world a better place. And that opportunity, I think, is worth us battling for.
I agree 100%, Sharon. And I think I want to end on a slightly less lofty note than you've just left us with by just quickly announcing that we are very fortunate to have received funding from the Australian Research Council to run a project over the next 4 years entitled Child-Centred Evidence to Drive Meaningful Social Change for Children. This project is a partnership between leading child rights experts across the country. John is part of that, for example, as well as our wonderful team of child rights organisations, so Save the Children, UNICEF Australia. Oh my goodness, I've just lost the other partner in my head. Child Fund Australia, my goodness me. And we're going to be working together, and Snake is also a partner there, excuse me. I should have had this better prepared. So those 4 wonderful child rights organisations are going to work with these scholars over the next 4 years to try to systematise an evidence base which is child-centred, so that we can provide child-centred evidence to support advocacy of child rights organisations across the country. So we will look forward to updating you about that project. We welcome you expressing interest in being part of the broader group that benefits from that project. And we're very, very excited that we've got this opportunity to put some effort and some funding behind child rights in this country. So thank you, Sharon, for a lovely conversation, and hope we can have a coffee soon. Back to you, Howard.
Thank you so much. And it's actually back to Matt.
We'll shuffle between us. But thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Sharon. It's one. It sort of felt like I was sitting in the lounge room listening to you both having a conversation. It's wonderful, and just reflecting between both of you and John and the three professors, and I'll put Howard in this, Professor Howard Chu, in this as well. That it's just amazing, hearing people that really understand so deeply what they're talking about. You just make really complex concepts and ideas and knowledge just seem really accessible and make sense. So thank you for sharing that all with us. It's not the end, and yeah, a couple of announcements today, I guess. So should have prefaced that at the beginning. So next we're going to hear our National Children's Commissioner Anne Hollins has joined us for a few of these series on children's rights over the years, and including our launch and a special one we did on youth justice last year. But look, Anne's overseas at the moment, so couldn't join us live today, but we did pre-record Howard having a conversation with Anne where she wanted to share some of the special initiatives of her office and some sort of advice and reflections actually on their work. But before we do that, we're going to hear directly, as I said I would, from some of the young people who advise our organisation at 54 and hold us accountable.
I think they need to take responsibility for the fact that our brains are growing. Obviously, we're our own people and we do our own dumb stuff. It's not their fault, but to take accountability, they have to actually listen to what we have to say. They have to incorporate into their everyday decisions on what they're gonna do with us, because it's something we really need. We need adults' help because we're young, we don't know what we're doing. So we do need guidance, even though we don't admit it. And I think that should definitely come from the people who look after us and care for us.
We need help, but we don't want to admit it. You need to approach a kid and I don't know, when someone doesn't want to ask for help, you should give them the space to ask for it, I guess. Even if they don't admit it for a long time, they need to be the one to speak up.
And thank you for making the time to catch up and chat today. Our theme today is driving systems change through a child rights approach. Would you mind maybe just starting by sharing what that means to you and why it's important?
So, I was thinking systems change is a term that can be a little bit opaque. People use it to mean different things. And I suppose for me, systems change is at its simplest level is about making sure that our service systems should be designed to meet the needs of children and their families. So it's ensuring that, that these systems aren't just sort of looking upwards to meet the needs of government or ministers, but they're actually focused on the real life needs of kids and families on the ground. And to do that, what we need to do is to be listening to what kids and their families say that they need, so what they need, but also how they want to be helped. So that participatory approach to design is really important. That, of course, is core to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that we are listening and then acting on what we've heard. And also to recognise that the Convention it's like a compass that we can use to guide our policy decision making. It has a very practical value that is often misunderstood and not recognised. And I think that if we were to take the Convention on the Rights of the Child much more seriously in the reform of our systems, in the redesign, particularly of those basic systems that we know as taxpayers we're paying for, and they cost a lot. Things like systems like health and education, for example, that we're making sure that they are designed to meet the needs of the people who need them. I'll just mention briefly, one tool that's useful for that, I think, is a Child Rights Impact Assessment tool. And luckily we do have one nationally in Australia now. and that and to note that there was a recent Senate inquiry that recommended that the Child Rights Impact Assessment tool be used widely across government portfolios for policy and legislation. So I think that these are the sorts of things we should be thinking about, and it's really important to have the Convention on the Rights of the Child as our compass when we're trying to drive systems change.
And there's a lot of what you've just said. I certainly agree with all of it wholeheartedly. And you do so much work to really change systems in the way that you're talking about, to keep children's rights at the centre of what we do and how we think, and that participatory side as well. And one of the pieces of work that you're really spearheading is the Act for Children campaign. And I wonder, could you tell us a bit about that campaign? What is Act for Children about?
Well, really, Act for Children came about because of the frustration of many people, many organisations across sectors at the lack of progress in terms of systems change based on decades of evidence. So, I think that everyone listening today will recognise and perhaps identify with that really deep sense of frustration. And so it's about trying to pull together advocates from across these different sectors, such as legal, medical, social work, child rights advocacy and academia and so forth, to put pressure on the political parties and the candidates in the lead up to the next federal election early next year. So this is a real opportunity for us to go along as an individual. We can go along to our local members and ask them, well, why is child safety and wellbeing not a priority for us in Australia? But I think collectively across all of these sectors and organisations, we can be elevating the need to put children's rights and needs up front and in the centre of everything that we're doing. And so this campaign, has been running some roundtables during this year. We're currently building a bit of a website to try to amplify the opportunity to get involved, and some of the key, commitments or priorities for us that we're hoping that people will be interested to sign up to together beyond our individual advocacy. So together, we're calling for a Cabinet Minister for Children, a national plan for child wellbeing that has national cabinet with its eyes on children. As we know, National Cabinet already has made other things their priority, such as ending domestic, family and sexual violence, which is fantastic. But there's nothing happening at National Cabinet that goes, we need to make sure children are our priority. And the final objective is for a National Act for Children, because currently there is no legislative accountability for the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which we in Australia ratified 34 years ago.
It's really remarkable when you say that, Anne, to think that there is no legislative basis for incorporating the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and also, as you say, nothing at cabinet level to ensure that children and their rights are a priority.
Well, it is. A lot of members of the public are surprised because, members of the public value children and recognise the need to invest in ensuring that kids have the best start in life. But, it's kind of well understood. But to see that governments are not prioritising children is a surprise to many people.
Now, one of the other really important interventions that I think you've made is the recent release of your major report, Help Way Earlier. And this one's really made some waves. What should everyone know about the Help Way Earlier report?
That's a really hard question in some ways, because it's a big report, and if people want to read it, all you have to do is put Help Way Earlier in your browser and it should just pop up straight away. But in other ways, it's quite an easy question to answer, because the story is simple. We're saying that as a result of the findings in this report, It's clear that in Australia we have misunderstood the problem that we're trying to solve here. And what we're seeing across all the jurisdictions who are responsible for child justice is that they're just making the justice systems tougher and tougher and more punitive, in the kind of the misguided belief that that will somehow stop crime. But there's no evidence for that. So this report is drawing on decades of evidence by many organisations in Australia and academics and from around the world that shows that the younger a child comes into contact with the criminal justice system, the more likely it is that they will continue to do more crime, more serious and more violent crimes. So what we need to do very urgently is to ensure that kids are not coming into contact with the criminal justice system at these incredibly early ages, like 8 and 10. I mean, it's terrible that we're seeing kids already being picked up by police at those ages. So they need to be at school. So we need to be looking at those upstream systems. We need to be strengthening our public health approach, particularly looking at health and education, family support services to make sure that kids and their families are getting the intensive help that they need. Some of these kids with serious disabilities and mental health concerns and problems like poverty and serious disadvantage, these kids are not getting this help that they need. So the only way we're going to prevent crime is to address these underlying factors, because crime by children is just a symptom of the underlying factors we're failing to address. That's pretty much the story of the Help Way Earlier report. And I'll just add that in the report there's a section on the barriers to acting on evidence and human rights. And this is something that I've become very interested in primarily because we've got this decades of evidence we're not really paying attention to. So I think we need to start talking much more about why. What are the barriers to action and what are we going to do about it? And I'll just mention 2 barriers that came up very strongly when we asked these questions for the Help Way Earlier report. One was that the Federation is being used as an excuse not to act on the evidence and not to work together across Australia to solve these problems that really are national problems. And another barrier is the way the media operates and the role of the media that is amplifying incidents of crime and making people more fearful when in fact overall youth crime has decreased. And the media is not interested in the solutions to addressing the problem of the small cohort of young people who are involved in repeat offences, addressing those underlying needs that those young people have. So strangely, even though we talk a lot about youth crime, we're kind of not really focused on the solutions to it, not properly, not based on the evidence. And I often think it's a bit like climate change. You know, where for many years we just didn't believe the science. And I think it's time we believed the science and acted on the science of what will prevent crime by children.
That's powerful. I couldn't agree more. And listening to you speak, it's just I'm remembering how much great work is being done around Australia to advance children's rights, as well as how much still remains to be done. And I wonder, just as a final question to you, what would your advice be to everyone who's watching this about actually advancing children's rights in Australia?
So, as you say, Howard, absolutely, there's amazing work being done and actual, really strong advocacy happening. I saw that recently when Northern Territory lowered their age of criminal responsibility, and the national legal groups like the Law Council and the medical groups, the AMA and many others, and 50 paediatricians in the Northern Territory got together to put their case, and as well as all of us, who her involved. You know, like it was just an amazing effort. Of course, it didn't work, and that was because there was a belief that the government there had a mandate to lower the age. And what I said publicly about that was that they came in with a mandate to prevent crime. And what they now need to do as the government in power is to look at the evidence of what will actually prevent crime. So, you know, we're seeing these sort of the sloganeering, the ideas, the opinions being put out ahead of an election, but we really need, so this is a long way around to my answer, which is we need to call the governments to account for acting on the evidence of what will make a difference to the lives of the communities that they're actually responsible for, and we need to address the barriers to governments acting on the evidence. So I think the barriers, the many barriers, including the way government itself works and the political cycles that they are involved with, the pressures that they are under, we need to help them. We need to help government and MPs to do the right thing. So we need to speak up collectively about the evidence and what the human rights of children call us to do. But as I said, individually, we can also do this by speaking to our local members of parliament, presenting the evidence. For example, you know, the Helpway Earlier report has a lot of evidence in it that could be provided to government officials and to members of parliament. We need to give them the evidence, but we also need to say they need to elevate child wellbeing to be that priority we were discussing earlier. And so I think we need to work together. We need to speak with one voice for children across all the advocacy groups. This is, I guess, what the Act for Children campaign is all about, that we've recognised that we are, as advocates, often as fragmented as the policy environment is, and that we don't back each other in enough, probably. We don't pull together and speak together when it matters. And I think in the lead up to the federal election, it's going to matter, and that they need to hear from us collectively much more loudly about the responsibilities Australia has under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and indeed the other international conventions that we have signed up to.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Speaking with one voice for children, holding governments to account, making it practical, working together. So much to think about there. Thank you so much, Anne, as always, for your inspiration and leadership on children's rights.
Thanks, Howard, and have a great symposium, everyone.
I think that was really wonderful. I think we might be having a little bit of tech issues in the background, although we made it through that massive video, thank goodness. I might just jump in and introduce our next presenters, and I'm really excited to hear from them as well. So we are going to hear from Amy Lamoin and Nathan Gallagher from the Queensland Family and Child Commission. Amy is the Executive Director of the First Nations and Child Rights Advocacy team there at the Commission, and Nathan is the Child Rights Lead in the same team. And they both work with and under the leadership of Commissioner Natalie Lewis, who is, and with that team, doing some really, I think, powerful and impactful work within Queensland, but that really has a national relevance. And Amy and Nathan are going to tell us just a little bit, give us a bit of a sneak preview about their work to develop the 2024 Queensland Child Rights Report. So Amy and Nathan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Howard. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm on the lands of Nathan and I both on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples in Brisbane, Queensland. I'm just going to make a few opening remarks and then hand over to Nathan. But I think as a general reflection, on World Children's Day, the sector tends to celebrate, and that's wonderful. I think there's a lot to celebrate. But I think importantly, it should be a conversation about practical progress around the realisation of children's rights. And so as much as we should be celebrating, there's a very solid conversation to have around accountability. And I think one of the most important parts of the Children's Convention is certainly the general measures section. What you just heard Commissioner Anne Hollands talk about speaks to those kind of general measures. How do we operationalise children's rights in terms of our systems? And I guess those systems continue to fail children. And I would say very strongly, in particular, we see those systems fail, in particular, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children nationally, and certainly in Queensland. I thought it might be useful, before Nathan talks about our approach to monitoring child rights in Queensland, if I just might touch on some of the kind of key elements of the approach that Commissioner Natalie Lewis takes to overall systems change. And certainly, you know, systems change it's a comprehensive picture. It's really about, as Anne mentioned, tackling those systemic barriers in practical terms and ensuring that there's overall policy cohesion for children and young people. Participation, we've heard a lot about that today. That's certainly at the centre. I think what we need to hear more about is actual quality participation. What does quality participation look like when we are inclusive of children and young people in our decision making? We can't talk about systems and not reflect properly on root causes. I think that's part of the big challenge we see in terms of the gaps with the child protection and youth justice statutory systems. Are we properly considering the impact of poverty, of inequality, and of problematic social norms? Are we actually looking at a proper holistic picture in relation to that holistic view of systems change and certainly the survival, development, protection and participation rights of children? I think equity is key to how Natalie approaches all of her work, that we have to be front and centre around, you know, where the system has its most harsh consequences and for whom. Anti-racism is a key part of this conversation, certainly in the child protection and justice systems, which are really a continuation of problematic and historic legacy policies. And on that front, I think it's important, if we're talking about real systems change, having an honest conversation around there being very good reasons why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and young people and families don't and are unable to trust our systems, and being honest about that picture is certainly key. So being able to actually really address anti-racism as part of that overarching conversation. Natalie's really committed as well to kind of capacity building across our institutions, and what Nathan will speak about shortly is really looking at evidence and being adaptive in terms of that evidence and making sure that our evidence is connected up to a picture of change across our systems. Ultimately, you know, that monitoring picture is key in relation to child rights, ensuring there is adequate progress over time, and measuring both impact, but also looking at those key benchmarks for progress. Thanks, Nathan. I might hand over to you.
Thanks, Amy. Good afternoon, everyone. It's I'll just reiterate, it's really wonderful to have these conversations on World Children's Day as well. So we've got a few minutes just to briefly introduce you to a snapshot of the Every Child, Every Right, Every Time Queensland Child Rights Report. And, you know, certainly in the context of driving systems change, you know, what does action actually look like? So to introduce these four key elements really briefly, I know that we've only got a few minutes to do so, so we won't do a deep dive. And because we've only got a few minutes, we also don't have the space and the time to facilitate a conversation. But what I would invite you to do is reflect on and think about your thoughts when you see Every Child, Every Right, Every Time just there, because it's one of the things that we certainly did developing that title was talking through with children and young people. You know, we often have conversations around child rights with young people, and one of the most common things is, what does inalienable mean? What does indivisible mean? What does interdependent mean? And so Every Child, Every Right, Every Time was a very purposeful way to represent the three of those in a call to action. And it doesn't mean that every conversation we have with children and young people, you know, we all have the same understanding of a rights-based approach and what that looks, sounds and feels like. But it does mean that we remove that barrier a little bit and be really mindful of our language when reflecting those key rights principles. The second element to what we've developed for the report is what we call action ethics. And again, we don't have time for a deep dive, but essentially, in the spirit of driving systemic change, how do we take those guiding principles, those key articles that are really important, and turn them into action ethics? Action ethics are, we all prescribe to a set of beliefs or principles, but how do we put them into action? How do we live and breathe them every day? What are we working towards? What do they look, sound, and feel like? And that's one of the things that we've definitely built into the report. With our monitoring methodology and reporting methodology, there's a lot more detail that goes into these. The Queensland Child Rights Report was done by the QFCC last year as a proof of concept, and we're building on that very purposefully as we go. Things that we learn, reflections with children, young people, practitioners, organisations, community. And we've articulated a little bit more about a monitoring and reporting methodology today. We're going to give you a really brief snapshot on. These are a couple of things that we wanted to really focus on when we were thinking about the processes around the Queensland Child Rights Report this year. So, we kind of want to aim to be transparent and measured and objective and structured and all really important things. But we also wanted to amplify voices and perspectives and those stories of all children. Amy referred to Commissioner Natalie Lewis and the team here sees equity as something that's really important. It's something that we constantly talk about and that conversation evolves. But we really want to amplify the voices of children, especially who have barriers to being able to amplify or discover their voice in a lot of, in the context of systemic discrimination. This next one, highlighting environmental accountability. One of the core questions for this whole process is, and it's a question that we all ask ourselves a lot in the rights community, and that is, how do we flow through those core ideas of dignity and agency in everything that we do? What does that mean to the Child Rights Report, and what does that mean to how we plan the Child Rights Report, how we design it? What are the processes and that flow through to reporting as well? And so this idea that we absolutely want to highlight accountability, but we also want kind of meaningful accountability mechanisms, in a systemic perspective, because a system is just, interconnected relationships, right? A system doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not something that happens outside of us. It's something that we're all a part of. And so how do we think about, very specifically ensuring that we affirm and protect rights, but also how do we hold duty bearers and all of us accountable to that duty for a rights realizing environment, that ecological perspective, that systemic way of making rights more likely to be attuned to, more likely to be protected, more likely to be realized. And then also we need to ask ourselves a really important and deep question, which is how does rights affirming practice, how is it applied in our monitoring process? Sharon and Amanda talked before about the notion of sometimes voice processes and voice systems become quite extractive and they can be exploitative. Certainly a lot of that is unintentional. But it's really important to remember the notion of voice fatigue. Children and young people, and many of us, especially when you're experiencing really big systemic, factors of systemic discrimination, we all get voice fatigue, right? Especially talking to children and young people. We talk about building into voice processes that idea that we're really mindful and really attuned to what the experience of participation is for children and young people. So the last thing I guess we wanted to do is, speak to another young person and feel or be extractive. That's the last thing that we wanted to do. We certainly didn't want to make connecting to voices a transactional process. So this is a quick snapshot of the framework itself, and making children's rights real is a term that we're all very familiar with. Commitments, efforts, results, and opportunities is also something that we're quite familiar with, and as we generate and amplify dialogue, and we assess and we analyze and we either plan for action or we discuss what action is required, we really wanted to step out what that actually means, what it actually looks, sounds, and feels like for the report. And so you can see there, we talk about and discuss and assess commitments, efforts, results, opportunities in the report, but we also articulate those accountability markers. So what is the principal accountability for duty bearers? What is the process accountability? We talk about systems change, and we often talk about the process being more important than the outcome, because if we focus on the system, then we amplify those outcomes. Where does outcome accountability sit? And so you can see there, we've kind of gone through a process of connecting to legislation, connecting to policy, thinking about and searching out where active efforts are sitting, especially in Queensland, the state of play of child rights in Queensland. Where are efforts really required? And that's really core in terms of driving systems change. And then outlining where we're in a rights affirming space, where rights have been breached. And that kind of leads us into, opportunities and that assessment around opportunities. So where is urgent action required in terms of what the call to action for the report in each of the chapters, but also what are the potential futures? And that's one of the really critical things about an ecological approach, driving systemic change. We've really got to be really articulate and really clear about urgent action required, but we also need to be mindful of language, mindful of the way that we craft and plan potential futures for a rights realizing environment. So that, just gives you a really quick snapshot. And, certainly, I mean, we could talk about the dynamics of each of our states in terms of the state of play of child rights, but it's important for us to realize, it's not what is perfect, but what can we influence and drive? What is something like a child rights report, a monitoring process and a reporting process? How can we drive and influence change and action, which is exactly what today's about. So I think that's just about time. I've probably gone over. But I just wanted to note that the 2024 Queensland Child Rights Report is being launched on the 29th of January. And one of the key chapters in this year's report is our spotlight chapter on young people with a refugee or migrant experience, which was a really beautiful piece of work that Multicultural Australia took the lead on, co-designing workshops and co-designing and co-facilitating workshops for young people around that particular spotlight chapter. All right. Thanks very much.
Nathan and Amy, thank you.
Back to Howard.
Yes, it is back to me. Every child, every right, every time. I really love it, just for what it's worth. It's powerful to me, and I love what you said, Nathan, about taking that richness and the complexity of children's rights, and also some of that language in which it's expressed, and then translating it in this sort of, I think, really simple but still really rich way. It's landing really nicely. And 29th of January, so let's circle that in our diaries for the release of that report, because it's a really substantial piece of work, I know. I can't wait to see it. We are tiny bit behind time, but there are just so many amazing questions in the Q&A, so I think we might take a bit of a risk and just try to squeeze in one question. So Nathan and Amy, if we could hold you, and also John and Amanda bring you back in. I'm just going to pull out a question from Hannah Woodward, which I think is a really nice one. So Hannah has asked, what are the top things we can do to start to shift the public and policy discourse away from welfare and protection to child rights to help us to make important reforms for children? And Hannah's given the example of such as raising the age of criminal responsibility, which is obviously a really critical policy reform. And I'd really love all of your thoughts, if you could give really brief ones, about Hannah's broader question. What are some of the top things we can do to start to shift that discourse from welfare and protection to rights? Is anyone brave enough to go first? John, please.
Launching in. Great question. I'll briefly start the conversation, I think, is the first thing, and call it out. So wherever we possibly can. So in my role as an academic, it would mean, raising this conversation in sporting clubs, in schools, in kindergartens, in conversations with colleagues. I think we have to start talking about it in a way that's respectful, goes back to Howard's conversation around how we frame the conversation as well. But if we just keep waiting for politicians to change the way they do things, we'll be waiting forever. It won't happen there. It's got to come from a grassroots, ground up sort of shift. And I find when I do discuss this model and compare it and contrast it with a welfare and rights-based approach in, for example, a situation with, say, maternity or midwives, they sort of get it, right? And they're kind of happy to take it on board. But when we frame it in ways that would condemn, alienate, ostracize people, it's not a great approach. So part of it's the framing, but it's starting a conversation wherever you can possibly have it, which is a bit of a cop-out, but we can't wait for governments to put into education curriculums. We can't wait for politicians to start doing, because it won't happen. We have to start the conversations locally and regularly, I think, is probably where it start that answer.
I'm happy to go next, Howard. I agree with John. I think that kind of kitchen table approach is incredibly important, and having a conversation with your everyday networks. Also importantly, I think child rights education is absolutely critical. Children need to understand their rights as a first step. It's also part of governments being held accountable. It's a requirement under the convention. It's part of our convention, part of government responsibility, and it's absolutely paramount. It's always something that we say is critical, and it's never resourced by government's comprehensive child rights education.
And I would lift off on that and say we could also have comprehensive education on child rights for our decision makers. I think we need to actually make a concerted effort to bring those who make decisions on behalf of children up to speed with what their obligations are under the convention. And I think we need to find clever ways to remind them, repeatedly and periodically about those responsibilities.
Lovely. Look, Nathan, would you like the last word?
Oh, thanks, Howard. Look, it's a really complex conversation, right? And John talked about starting the conversation, and we've also got to connect to the fact that this conversation's been going on for a long time, and the idea of a welfare approach is so deeply seated and foundational within our community that it's a really difficult kind of burden of knowing to have, right? Thinking about a child rights approach, or just a rights approach in general, thinking about the possibilities of that, and how we can unlock a few doors by shifting from welfare to rights. It's a really difficult and it's a deep-seated and enduring conversation. So I think that probably brings me to the points that you made about the framing piece of work, Howard, about language around how we have that conversation. I think it's really, really critical. And I think building rights language and action into decision makers kind of worlds is really important in terms of education. But I would also note that whenever we read a briefing document about a child rights assessment or a human rights assessment about a piece of legislation, and it outlines how critically how a rights approach is denied for children, but it also articulates that that's the balance that we needed to get this legislation right, for anyone who's read those briefing documents about those assessments. So yeah, it's difficult. It's not just about education, right? It's a very nuanced and very enduring conversation that needs to happen around, the deep-seated notions that enable that kind of thing to occur.
Completely agree. Nathan, Amy, Amanda, and John, thank you so much for those really quick and brilliant answers. And I should have also mentioned that Sharon did have to depart for an existing commitment, and she's not a rude person, so I ought to have mentioned that's why she's not still with us. Now, for the final part of this seminar, Matt did flag at the start that we've got a special announcement to make. Matt, are you able to come on and set us up for this?
Yeah, thanks, Howard. That was great, that Q&A. I just think one of the points Amy made just stayed with me about the capacity building. It sort of got picked up through the Q&A process there, but really there are very few examples of good, and we think about again some of the themes that have run through here, about how we actually do, like, there's power is finite, right? So you can talk about empowering, but you can't do that unless you actually are willing to give some away. And I think just as part of again Amanda's prompt about how do we have decision makers be educated. Like that's when we're talking about capacity building. Let's build the capacity of people with power, and including organisations like ours, right? I mean, most we're learning. Like I should have said that at the beginning. We're just learning. You know, it's we're so early on. So you know, to everyone here from other organisations, when we talk about sort of sharing our insights, it's not coming from a position of look how great we are. It's like really happy to share what we have learned along the way and what we're not doing well, what we're trying to do better, and what we still have to do. So I think that just that humility in it is like really important in a rights context. And again, from that Q&A, just the obligation that we do have. We have obligations to children and young people by virtue of the work that we do, and like that's just unspoken. In our sector that is meant to be socially minded and well informed, it's just unspoken. So it's not enough just to talk about children, and say that you're child-centered, let alone being coming from a child rights place. So anyway, did mention at the beginning that have a special announcement, and with great thanks to our sort of founding partners, including the three professors that are joining us today. We're wanting to sort of again just ask for everyone here and all of our sort of partners that around the sector really just to converge on child rights. That this isn't a space that we want to claim in terms of our sector. Actually, every organisation in this sector should be a child rights organisation. So, I guess the important thing for us is that doing this work doesn't mean that you just say it. It doesn't mean that token representation of young people. It does mean what you do with that, and what's required to be accountable. So when we've invited partners to sort of converge, to join us, whatever, on child rights, we've had years of dreaming on about how this could be done. How do we create that place and that space? Plenty of barriers to overcome, and a lot of incredibly hard work from very special people in my team, and as I said, our partners on this. But anyway, I'm going to hand over and sort of we'll do the back and forward dance, but really just invite and introduce Howard Shue as the director of this new initiative that we're going to present to you all, a place where all people can come together and converge on child rights.
Thanks, Matt. And I'm just going to stretch out the suspense a tiny bit more just to probably repeat something that Matt has said, because I think it's really important. So I'll say it in my own words, but I think, to create the change that we all want to see, to actually put children and their rights at the centre of our systems, to put children and their rights at the centre of our society in the way that we've all been talking about today, we need to work collectively and we need to do it together. So we really do need a shared understanding and a shared commitment that bridges across all of our sectors, all of our disciplines, all the different contexts that we're working in, all the different silos. So I think Matt used the language of converging around children's rights, that coming together, and for it to be something that happens, to see it in a really practical way. However, until today, we haven't had a place to come together around children's rights in that way in Australia. We haven't had a place to come together to learn and be inspired about children's rights in practice. So we do have a really exciting announcement. Today, we are launching a new Australian Centre for Child Rights. This is a national centre that's all about how to make children's rights real in practice. And it's something that we're doing that's been created collaboratively with our partners. So the centre's mission is to inform, inspire, and create change through a one-stop source for best practice in child rights and participation, and a thriving and collaborative child rights community. So to say that differently, the centre, as the many of us who've been part of creating it, as the way we think about it, it is a way to bring people together around children's rights. And it's a dear hope, I think, that we all share, that the centre itself will be a vehicle for actually catalysing systems change, with a child rights-based approach really is the organising principle for that systems change. So the centre's work, the work of the Australian Centre for Child Rights, which now officially exists as of today, World Children's Day, Centre's work is going to be, a lot of it's going to be around helping everyone to understand what children's rights are, why they matter, and what it actually looks like to uphold those rights in practice, how to uphold children's rights in practice. And that last bit is really important to all of us, that it's practical, that children's rights should be accessible in every sense, including the meaning of and how they are upheld. That should be something that everyone can recognise and see and understand what it means for them and for us. So to really make it real, The centre, of course, has a website, because these days what exists if you don't have a website? That website is live as of today. In a second, we'll show you a way to get to it. But you can enter it into your browser at centreforchildrights.org.au. I'll say that again, centreforchildrights.org.au. Have a look. If you jump onto that website, you'll see that there's a lot of resources that are there. Some of them have been newly created for the Australian Centre for Child Rights, and others are links to existing good practice resources with a lean towards those that are relevant in the Australian context, but looking to some really great practice from internationally as well, where that is relevant. And the idea there is it's a repository. It's a place where people can come to find out how to uphold children's rights in practical terms, including participatory rights as well as more broadly. And you'll also find on the Centre's website an indication of the Centre's ambitions. There's an early theory of change there for those who like a theory of change, and a sense of what we hope to achieve together over time. Now, the design of the centre and its shape has been very much informed by the advice of our young advisors, who you've heard from in snippets, heard from some of them over the course of today. And also, and I really want to emphasise this, the Centre for Child Rights has been really strongly shaped by so much input from so many people and organisations who are active and advocates for children's rights in Australia. We wouldn't be talking about it today if not for all of that amazing expertise and enthusiasm and support that's come from all over the place. The Centre has very much been designed to complement the critical work of the Australian Child Rights Task Force that already exists and other child rights institutions and organisations that work in Australia. I also really am particularly delighted to be able to just let you all know that the Centre has foundational partners, so this is not a 54 Reasons thing. It's very much been a collaborative enterprise, and you have heard from many of them today. And so those partners are the Young and Resilient Research Centre at Western Sydney, co-led by Amanda, the Children's Policy Centre at ANU, which is has Sharon as its director, the Melbourne Law School at the University of Melbourne, where John is the director of the Human Rights Program, and also SNAKE, the National Voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children. And that's really critical that there's a group of partners, along with many others who've been involved in helping to shape the concept and who will be part of its ongoing work. So I think I can probably speak for everyone who's been part of creating the Centre when I say that we've got big ambitions, but in some ways we're starting small. Someone, maybe you, Matt, before used the language of humility. In fact, it was, and there is a humility, I think, to how we're approaching the creation of the Centre. There's a lot of space to shape where the Centre goes, where its focus will be. I really think about the launch of the Australian Centre for Child Rights as an invitation in many ways. It's an invitation to all of you who've made the time to come to this seminar, be part of this conversation, but also to everyone out there who has an interest in children's rights or who should have an interest. So for everyone listening, we really want to hear your ideas. Take a look, think about how you might like to get involved or how you think the Centre could contribute to your work to advance children's rights. And please have a think about what you'd like to see from the Centre. And, once you've had a chance to reflect on that, do get in touch and come and join us. And I think on that note, I'm going to pass back to Matt to round us out for today's seminar.
Thanks, Howard. That's wonderful. It feels amazing, actually, just to finally be able to share it with everyone. And again, thanks for the people that have joined us today and our partners in this. I just want to finish up by sort of practically saying that, again, for our organisations, colleagues who are joining us here, go back to your organisations and find the challenge. As we heard earlier, this is it's a means, not an end, and it's not enough to say that you're a rights organisation. So if people in your organisation saying, you're about child rights, just challenge that. What are we doing? What are we doing to demonstrate that? I think boards should be asking their CEOs. Practitioners should be asking management, and management should be asking practitioners. And of course, children and young people should be able to ask us, and we should be able to answer that. If at the very least, if decision makers are not hearing the voices of children and their opinions about the things that we are doing and delivering, then you are not a rights organisation. So incredible, just to listen to you all today. Really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for joining. Next year, we will be planning a face-to-face child rights symposium on the back of this, and hopefully by that stage, the Australian Centre for Child Rights will be thriving, and a lot more formal sort of partners and participation will have built over that time. Yeah, look, other than that, really, as Howard said, see today, please, as an invitation to, let's all do this better, all collectively, and learn from each other. So last word for us, over to the young advisors. 54 Reasons Young Advisors, last word. Thank you.
Probably the right that we have to feel safe. Probably because it's just so important that you feel safe in your life, and as a child especially, because you're growing, you want to feel safe in your environment. And I think parents and adults, like, they all need to learn about that more, because they've got to contribute to making their kids feel safe.
I think that the voice, like the right to have your own voice, to have a say in anything that affects you, because like parents will do what they think is best, but that could be entirely different to what the child actually finds supportive and encouraging, or whatever, like anything that they think could help them, and the parents can just say whatever they want, can make their own decisions, and that could like ruin the child's future and like entire life, just because they didn't get to say their say, or like that they say it and then no one takes them seriously.